Hey guys, Brett Weiss here. Thank you so much for tuning in. Want to talk a little bit about my classic home video games book series. Now, instead of just being an infomercial, I'm going to give you guys some behind the scenes information, how I met the publisher, how this book series came about, how I got the idea for the series, and all that kind of stuff. So I hope you'll hang around and check it out. So, growing up, as I've told you guys before, big fan of, I love to read. Now, I was also an outdoor kid. I played outside a lot, but during the winters when I had bronchitis and it was too cold and windy for me to go outside, otherwise I would have gotten deathly ill. I was indoors a lot, so I watched TV, played with Hot Wheels, and I did read a lot. My mom would take me to used bookstores like Half Price Books and Book Rack and some others where we lived in a suburb of Fort Worth. And I mentioned that to you guys before, so let's go on with it. Now, I really liked the Guinness Book of World Records, and I love reference books. They just seem fascinating to me. My parents had encyclopedia sets. They had the regular encyclopedia set and the science encyclopedia set, and these fascinated me. I would pour through these for hours. And so anyway, I have a background in reference books. Perhaps that's why I started writing reference books. Now, I'd always wanted to write, and I never really got serious about it until the early 90s, early to mid 90s. And I started toying with some things. I wrote some short fiction that I had, had a little bit of success getting some stuff published in small press magazines. As a matter of fact, my very first paying work was $10 for a science fiction story in 1997 from an online magazine. And that was a memorable moment. That was pretty exciting. But I also was working on a Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis book during the 90s, but I could not find a publisher. Retro gaming books. The Genesis and Super Nintendo were sort of on their way out, and the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 and stuff were coming in, and so I just couldn't find a publisher interested in a Sega Genesis Super Nintendo book, and so that went by the wayside. And at that time, I mean, in the 90s, it was real hard to get publishers interested in gaming books anyway. I doubt I could have found a publisher for a PlayStation N64 book. It was just different market back then. Publishers didn't really see the need for a video game book. There were gaming books, but they were very few and far between. Nowadays, there's tons of gaming books in general, tons of retro gaming books specifically. And so, anyway, I started writing for the All Game Guide in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. And this was a website whose objective was to describe and review every video game and every computer game for every console and computer. Massive project, loved doing that. But after early 2000s, they let go everyone who wasn't there on site in Ann Arbor, Michigan. As a matter of fact, they offered me a job to move up there, but I was already here with my wife and everything, and kids weren't going to move up there. Anyway, so I was let go from the All Game Guide pretty much, and so that was a bummer. But after that, I started, I was still writing. I was writing for the Comics Buyer's Guide and some other magazines. And in 2006, at the 2006 San Diego Comic-Con, an incredible convention. This is the first and only time I'd ever been to San Diego Comic-Con. It was an amazing show because there were several things that made me want to go. 50th anniversary of Forbidden Planet, 50th anniversary of Silver Age Flash, and a bunch of other stuff. I'll have a whole Tales from a Retro Gamer episode about that San Diego Comic-Con because it was so exciting. 2006, I did have business cards with me. I was still ambitious to be a professional writer, and I was part-time at this point writing, for different publications, including Comics Buyer's Guide. And I was there with my cards and everything, and trying to look all professional. And McFarland Publishers was there. They are a book publisher that's been around a very long time, decades, and at least since the 80s, maybe the 70s. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they've been around a very long time. And I've read a number of their books, and I saw them set up at the at San Diego Comic-Con. They had a booth there, and I bought, I believe it was a Night Gallery book I bought from them, and I got to talking to one of the people manning the booth, and it was an editor. And she was, I guess, manning the booth. I guess that's kind of a sexist term these days, because this was a female that I was dealing with. Anyway, I talked to her, and she was really nice, and I left her a card, and I said, if any of these reference books that you guys are putting together, if you need help, if you need another contributor, or whatever. I didn't really know how the whole thing worked. You know, give me a call or give me a, you know, email or whatever. And so I left her a card. And with McFarland, I had read McFarland books and I was very well aware of them. They had been, you know, back in the day, they published books like this specifically for libraries. They didn't even have dust jackets, and they were very expensive books. And I was very familiar with them. As a matter of fact, when I worked at Walden Books, we didn't carry their books because they were really expensive, and they were pretty much designed for, you know, libraries, because they weren't very attractive from a retail standpoint because they didn't really have colorful covers or anything. And I ordered if you worked at Walden Books, they would let you order books that you wanted to read. And when you were done with them, you could just put them on the shelf. That was one of the perks of working at Walden Books. And so I ordered several of these McFarland books, and they were $40, $50, $60. And they would be entered into the computer, and I would take them home and read them and bring them back to the store, and they would get put back on the shelf. But the computer, recognizing these as some obscure, McFarland published a lot of, it was a small press publisher. They published a lot of obscure reference guides, like, you know, German expressionist cinema of the 1930s or whatever. And so the computer would see these as, you know, just random obscure books, and after a couple of months of them not selling, which they wouldn't because they were super expensive, the computer would discount them to like $6 or something. So I would end up buying the games the books I would order. And Walden Books ended up shutting that perk down after, you know, I was ordering these books. I wasn't trying to do anything wrong. I was just working within the system, ordering books I wanted to read and put them on the shelf. But once Walden Books saw that all these books were going unsold and the computer was automatically, you know, putting them in the discount bin for very cheap, they quit that program. Anyway, I'm getting off field here a little bit, but McFarland, I knew they published a lot of interesting reference books, a lot of entertainment-related reference books that weren't, you know, in the 90s, in the 2000s, retro gaming books were sort of considered like a fringe, kind of obscure category. And McFarland, they had published maybe a computer book and a tiny bit of stuff with video games, but they hadn't really ever published a full-fledged retro gaming book. But I thought they would be the perfect publisher for it. And so when I got home 3 days later after San Diego Comic-Con, I was, you know, hanging out, you know, just writing or whatever, and I got this email, and it was from McFarland, and they said, do you have, you know, nice meeting you in San Diego, do you have any good book ideas? Well, I was like, absolutely. And so when I was with the All Game Guide, one of their objectives was to put out a series of books. Well, they canceled that project, and so I thought, I will just do this myself. I will take it upon myself to, you know, do all these write-ups for different consoles, you know, complete libraries and everything. And so before I get into the publication of that first book, I want to give you a little bit of my influence for this type of book. So primary influence was Leonard Maltin's books, his movie guides. The most recent one I have is 2000, but I used to read these all the time. And there were, you know, no pictures or anything. They were just, you know, reference books. They would give you a synopsis and little critique of each film. You know, thousands and thousands of films. I wanted to do something like this for video games. And I had that idea in my head for a very long time because there hadn't really been much like that in the way of video games before. Now, Leonard Herman, the game scholar and a good friend of mine, he had written ABC to the VCS back in the 90s. And this is the second edition, published much later. But the first edition was in the mid-90s. And sorry, Leonard, I forgot to write down exactly when this was published, but he was way ahead of the game. And this was the very first book to completely cover an entire console, every game for the system. And as you can see, this second edition has screenshots and everything. This book is out of print, but it was very influential on me. You know, it told me, hey, I can tackle entire consoles myself. If he could do it, it gave me the confidence to cover, you know, full libraries of game consoles. Now, there's another book series of note that's interesting and important to include is Digital Press, published by Joe Santulli, and who created the Digital Press website and fanzines. Well, him and his team created a series of books that were you know, complete with consoles. See, I would use the books to mark off the games I had written about or had in my collection or whatever. Really useful guides. And there's a lot of information in here, but a lot of the games, they don't actually have synopses or reviews or anything. It's just the title and some data. So they're complete as far as lists of games, but they don't have write-ups for every game. There's a ton of games that don't have actual write-ups, just, basic data. But anyway, this was very influential on me as well, as was the Digital Press website and things like that. As another influence was the Electronic Games magazine. I grew up reading these in grocery stores, just beautiful, and it let me know you could take video games seriously and write about them. Very well done, published by, and edited by Bill Kunkel, Joanna Worley, and Arnie Katz. Great influence on me. I grew up reading these. I couldn't buy them all, couldn't afford them, so I would read them in the grocery stores, and just awesome. So, getting back to McFarland. So they wanted me, I talked to them, I wanted to do, for McFarland, I want to do a big fat book like this, covering, every game for every console, back from the original Magnavox Odyssey in 1972, all the way up to who knows when, maybe like the Super Nintendo in the 90s in that era. And so I started working on it, and it was going to be a massive volume, and each game was only going to get maybe 2 or 3 sentences, or maybe a short paragraph or whatever, because it was going to be so massive, so many games and so many systems. Well, I got to talking to McFarland, and they said, why don't we divide this up into multiple volumes? Because there's just so many games, and this would be such a thick book, and you could have, a little bit longer write-ups if you would divide them up. So we decided to divide them into eras. And the first book was Classic Home Video Games, 1972 through 1984. It was first published in hardcover for $55, which, it's a little pricey for a hardcover book with black and white photos, but they are, textbook binding, very nice books, about on par with a textbook. That's about what you would pay. But McFarland was noted for, their books were pretty expensive. Well, later, they would come out in softcover for $25, which, much better, much more affordable. And anyway, the first book, Classic Home Video Games, 72 through 84, came out in 2007. And the softcover then came out in 2012. And I remember the first Classic Gaming Expo that I went to as a published author. I didn't actually have a booth, but I just brought a bunch with me, and I sold them in line to people the first day of the show. And actually sold 17 copies of a $55 book just as people were in line, because it was kind of a novelty to have an entire book dedicated to the Atari 2600, Intellivision, Atari 5200, Odyssey 2, all these systems, even like the Arcadia 2001, the Bally Astrocade, the Adventure Vision, even Microvision, and people just thought that, wow, this is really cool. And so then in 2009, my second book, the hardcover version here, again, $55, Classic Home Video Games, 85 through 88. Now, I'll get to the numbering on the cover in just a minute, because that confuses a lot of people. I want to explain that real quick. And so the soft cover came out in 2012. So the hardcover of this came out in 2009, so that was a couple of years later, and then the soft cover was 2012 as well, like the first book. Then in 2011, my third book, third and final so far of the Classic Home Video Game series, again, it's hardcover, $55, and it's got pictures throughout, mostly like box art and cartridges and things like that. And Classic Home Video Games 89 through 90, covering the Genesis, TurboGrafx, and Neo Geo. Now, there is some confusion regarding cover dates, 89 through 90. So let me explain that real quick for those of you who don't know. And I have to, if I could go back again, I would number these, title these a little different, but the publisher really wanted me covering, when we decided to do multiple volumes, they wanted me to cover specific console eras. So 72 through 84, that refers to when these consoles came out, when the actual consoles themselves came out. Like 72 was the original Magnavox Odyssey, and up through 84, like the 2600 came out in 77, so that's in here. The ColecoVision came out in 82, that's in here. But the games themselves, the dates go beyond that. So this covers, Atari 2600 games that came out in the late 80s, Intellivision games that came out in the late 80s, and on and on. So every game for every console represented has an entry in here, regardless of when it came out, as long as, original releases with the console. So it goes beyond 84 as far as the individual games, but within console releases, it's 72 through 84. For example, and it cuts off at 84 because in 85 is when the NES was test marketed in the US. And so this book picks up with 85 through 88. Now, 3 systems came out during that time period in the US, the NES, the Atari 7800, and the Sega Master System. So it covers all 3 of those consoles, every game for each one of those consoles. Now, it cuts off at 88 because in 89 was a new little console era, because that's when the Neo Geo, TurboGrafx 16, and Sega Genesis came out. Those came out in 89, and it covers through 90 because in 1991, the Super Nintendo came out. So each book covers a specific console era, but within each book, it has every cartridge for all those systems that are mentioned. That's a little, I have to explain this over and over again at video game conventions because it confuses a little people. And I've talked to McFarland about maybe retitling all these books, but they said that's a big undertaking and it's just not worth it. They would have to republish them and get new copyright and all that stuff. So I just have to keep explaining it, that within each book, it's completely comprehensive for cartridge releases, but the book cover dates refer to when the actual consoles themselves came out. Now, the next book would have been Classic Home Video Games, like 92 through 94 or something like that. For the next few consoles, it was going to cover volume 4 of the Classic Home Video Game series, was going to cover the Super Nintendo, the 3DO, the CDI, and the Atari Jaguar, because those consoles came out early to mid-90s, and or early 90s really, because then you got into the PlayStation and then Nintendo 64 and stuff after that. If I were to do a 5th volume, which would have been nuts, because there's tons of PS1 games. Anyway, the 4th volume was going to cover those 4 consoles, but by this time, retro game book publishing had really blossomed, really bloomed, and really gotten much more sophisticated, and there were many more books coming out, and there were these big hardcover books coming out with full color photos and all this stuff. So instead of doing a book with the Super Nintendo and these other obscure systems in black and white through McFarland, I decided to switch publishers to use the publisher of my 100 Greatest book, which was Schiffer. And what I did was I wrote 2 books, the SNES Omnibus Volume 1 and the SNES Omnibus Volume 2. This covers every release, every US release for the Super Nintendo, all 700 plus games. And it's full color, screenshots, cartridge photos, box art. And it's also got quotes from other sources, from magazines, websites, and I've got stories from popular gamers, from YouTubers, from authors like Blake J. Harris, Tim Lapatino, YouTubers like John Riggs and Kelsey Lewin, and all these kinds of people. And so that's going to lead up to my next couple of books, the NES Omnibus. And I will talk to you more about the NES Omnibus Volumes 1 and 2 another time. But the SNES Omnibus, I was originally going to do that as 1 volume. But my publisher, Schiffer, suggested dividing it into 2 volumes so each game could get a full page or more. And so anyway, thank you so much for listening to my long, slightly convoluted history of the Classic Home Video Game series. Hope you enjoyed it. And in the comments, do you own any of these books in the Classic Home Video Game series? If you do, please comment below. Just say like where you got them, when you got them, what you think of the books, positive or negative, whichever way, you roll. Happy to hear from you. Anyway, happy Easter. It is Easter Sunday. It's kind of a strange Easter because we're at home. We're not over at my mom's hiding eggs for the kids to hunt, for my nieces and nephews. Really miss that, but we're going to make the best of it and try to have a good day. Anyway, thanks for liking the video. Just below this video and to the right, you can click on that subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. All right, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you guys later. Peace out.